Welcome to the Love Story Vlog channel, Queen's Story. Now let's enjoy part 6 of the story, Bowing Low. Chapter 8. Winter days passed quickly. By the time the soldiers had returned to their camps and Wei Zhao entered the city, dusk had already fallen. Outside the great gates of Xin City, torches flickered in the cold wind. A thick layer of snow had settled on his armor. His boots crunched loudly on the snow as he strode up the stone steps. Just then, Wei Liang, who had greeted him at the city gates earlier, seemed to remember something. He hurried to catch up, leaned close, and whispered, "My lord, the lady from the Chow family has arrived. She has been staying in the Wu Yang residence for over half a month. According to Madame Zhang, she is very quiet. During the day, she mostly stays in her room and doesn't go out. Sometimes at dusk, she goes up to the Dan Tower to stand for a while. Since she didn't seem to cause any trouble, I didn't interfere," he quickly added after his initial report. Wei Zhao responded with only a faint, "Ah," and without slowing his pace, he stepped through the doors and headed straight toward the Xia Yang residence, where he usually stayed. Wei Liang watched his retreating figure. After walking a few more steps, Wei Zhao suddenly stopped, turned his head, and glanced toward the direction of Wu Yang residence. Through several layers of large doors, one couldn't clearly see the other side. Only the towering shadow of the Dan Tower was visible. In the dark, it loomed like a crouching beast, ready to spring forth at any moment. "Tell Madame Zhang to prepare. The wedding will be held tomorrow," he said abruptly, withdrawing his gaze. "Tomorrow?" Wei Liang was slightly taken aback. "There might not be enough time. Keep it simple." Wei Zhao resumed walking forward without another pause. Wei Liang watched him for a moment, hesitated, then hurried off to find Madame Zhang and discuss the arrangements. After living together for half a month, the two old nursemaids had grown rather close to Xuannu, which allowed her to gather some information. According to them, Madame Zhang was once a trusted attendant of Wei Zhao's grandmother, Lady Tu. She had only recently entered Xin Palace to prepare for the marriage between Wei Zhao and Xiao Qiao. Also, it was said that not long ago, Wei Zhao had been away from the city because new battles had broken out again in Bowling. Now, he had returned victorious. At the start of this year, chaos had begun to spread. One rebel army after another was growing stronger, except for a few like Mu Gaotang in Ji Prefecture, who had exposed himself to, soon without sufficient strength, and became an easy target. The rest of the feudal lords, including Wei Zhao, still maintained an outward appearance of loyalty, declaring themselves vassals of the Han and obeying the emperor's commands. As for the internal power struggles, the strongest simply prevailed. The imperial court had long since lost the power to control them. Ji Prefecture, one of the ancient 9 prefectures. In truth, Xiao Qiao had little interest in what Wei Zhao was doing. Having been here for over half a month, now that she had finally seen him appear, her primary concern was what would happen next. According to the agreement between their two families, the time had now come to complete the final and most important step, the wedding. "Do not worry, my lady. Now that Lord Wei has returned, everything will proceed more easily. Tomorrow I will speak to Madame Zhang and find out exactly when the wedding will take place." Seeing Xiaoqiao dazed, Xuannu thought she was anxious and hurried over to comfort her gently. "My lady, please open the door." At that moment, the voice of one of the Wei family's nursemaids came from outside. Xuannu gripped Xiao's hand once more before going to open the door, only to be surprised to see Madame Zhang, whom they hadn't seen for some time. After entering, Madame Zhang gave a respectful bow to Xiao and immediately straightened to say, "The Lord has returned. The wedding will be held tomorrow. I've come to inform you in advance." With that, she bowed again and turned to leave. Wei Zhao had only just returned, and already an announcement had been issued. The wedding would be held the very next day. Why so soon? Xiao Qiao was momentarily stunned. While she was still trying to process this, Xuannu and the nearby maids were already beaming with joy, quickly kneeling to offer their congratulations. Xiao Kao understood their thinking. Everyone had come here awaiting this very event. Only through the formal ceremony would she truly become a daughter-in-law of the Wei family, the wife of Wei Zhao. Without this final step, no matter how many complicated rituals she went through, she would only hold a half title, a position that would always remain somewhat humiliating. That was why they all secretly breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this news. Xiao Qiao forced a smile and graciously accepted their blessings. But inside her heart was a tangled mess. The upcoming wedding wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Once they were officially husband and wife, it would mean that from then on, her fate would be forever bound to this man called Wei Zhao. But would he treat her as he had treated Da Qiao in her previous life? If so, what should she do? This question had plagued her ever since the day she left Yuan Prefecture, and even now, she still couldn't find an answer. Xuanyu's joy did not last long, for she knew this wedding would lack the grandeur a daughter of General Shi deserved. But thinking about it, what could they possibly prepare overnight? Suppressing the bitterness in her heart, she dared not show it in front of Xiao Qiao, afraid of saddening her. As she assisted with Xiao Qiao's bath, she forced a cheerful expression and said that the wedding would be held in the grand hall of Xiaoyang and that many distinguished guests would attend. Most importantly, Lord Wei was young, handsome, brave, and decisive. Countless young women had fallen for him at first sight, but from what she had gathered, he seemed to have no consorts or concubines by his side. How could Lord Wei not love such a beautiful lady? Xuanyu said warmly, applying fragrant balm to Xiao Qiao's soft skin, her gaze lingering appreciatively on the young woman's stunning appearance. Under Xuanyu's and the maid's attentive care, Xiao Qiao found herself reminded of the day she had departed. A bath, new clothes, hair combed and styled, makeup applied. She stood before the mirror, staring at the bride, blooming like a flower in her reflection, yet the image felt strangely unfamiliar. According to the rites of Zhou, marriage was tied to the word dusk. The rites of Zhou, one of the 3 ancient Chinese ritual texts, along with the Book of Rites and the Etiquette and Ceremonial. The word Hun, marriage, shares a homophone with Hun, dusk, evening. In ancient times, weddings took place in the evening, hence the term wedding ceremony. As dusk tilted westward, the usually quiet Xin Palace gradually lit up, shimmering like a jeweled pagoda beneath the twilight, its splendor even more dazzling under the night sky. Citizens in the city looked up and whispered among themselves, the Lord was getting married. Tonight, a red lantern now hung from the main corridor of the Xiaoyang Grand Hall. Inside the brightly lit hall, it looked like broad daylight. A long black table had been placed in the center, bearing items prepared for the wedding ceremony. The attending guests sat in their formal attire, positioned according to rank behind several long tables, chatting as they waited for the auspicious hour. Most of the guests were Wei Zhao's own followers, with a few officials from Xindu present as well. They, too, had only learned of the wedding that morning, although some had already known about the arranged marriage between Wei Zhao and the daughter of the Qiao family in Yuan Prefecture. The suddenness of the ceremony still came as a surprise. After all, Wei Zhao had only returned from the battlefield at Boling late last night. The old affairs between the Qiao family and the Wei family were known to most of those present. It was precisely because of this that the fact that Wei Zhao was now forming a marriage alliance with the Qiao family's daughter 10 years later was even more puzzling to many. Their curiosity about this young lady from the Qiao family grew all the stronger. They were all waiting eagerly to see her. The auspicious hour arrived, and Xiao Qiao entered the ceremonial hall. As she lightly gathered the hem of her long gown and appeared before the guests, the previously lively hall suddenly fell silent. Countless pairs of eyes turned toward her, watching intently, some with curiosity, some with astonishment, and some with puzzling scrutiny. Despite this, Xiao Qiao did not feel nervous. With her eyes slightly lowered, she quietly watched her feet moving forward. She walked slowly, accompanied by the sonorous chanting of the master of ceremonies, ringing in her ears, and the many, scrutinizing gazes from all directions. 2 attendants led the way beside her. Eventually, she reached the inner hall and stopped a few steps away from the long table. Across from her stood a man. She could clearly feel his gaze, unlike all the other looks around her, which she could easily ignore. His gaze fixed directly on her, unwavering, carrying a subtle but unmistakable sense of pressure. Even through the many layers of her ceremonial garments, her skin could feel this pressure. Her pores tightened, and the fine hairs on her neck seemed to stand on end. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet the gaze of the man before her. In contrast to his status and reputation, Wei Jiao was still relatively young. Yet compared to herself, he was already a fully grown man, broad-shouldered, with a tall, straight figure. Standing face to face with him like this, she appeared all the smaller by comparison, needing to tilt her head slightly upward, just to meet his eyes. As Yuan Nu had described, he was an exceptionally handsome man. He wore a ceremonial crown embroidered with 9 dragons, a dark robe adorned with patterns of flowing clouds, his bearing calm and dignified. As the master of ceremonies continued chanting the rites, he kept staring straight at Xiao Qiao, without blinking once. His eyes were dark and deep, like the night beyond the hall. Xiao Qiao's eyelashes trembled slightly. She lowered her gaze once again. When the master of ceremonies finished chanting, an attendant brought over a red ribbon. One end was placed in Xiao Qiao's hand, the other in Wei Jiao's. Holding the ribbon together, the 2 walked slowly toward the large table. The ribbon was then removed, and the 2 of them sat facing each other. Following the instructions of the master of ceremonies, they performed the hand-washing ritual, Guan Li, to symbolize being raised with good upbringing, followed by the lustration ritual, and then the Heijin ceremony, in which the bride and groom drank cross-cupped wine. After this series of elaborate rituals, finally came the final act, the hair-binding ceremony, a symbol of becoming husband and wife. Servants beside them cut a small lock of hair from each of them and tied them together. At this point, the guests were all beaming with joy. Congratulatory voices echoed one after another. The man opposite her remained sitting upright and unmoving, but Xiao Hao noticed the faintest lift at the corner of his mouth, as if fleeting and barely there. If she wasn't mistaken, that expression was clearly one of impatience, accompanied by a faintly indifferent smile. Chapter 9. Yesterday, they returned victorious from Bo Lang, having crushed the rebel forces of Chen Xiang and Qingzhou. Tonight was the grand wedding of the Marquise. In the barracks, goats and pigs were slaughtered. Wine was served freely, a rare indulgence granted in celebration by the Marquis himself. Wei Jiao had begun leading troops personally at the age of 17. On campaign, he always shared meals and tents with his soldiers. When it came to storming cities and seizing territory, he was the first to charge, setting an example for his men. Yet when it came to discipline, he was extraordinarily strict and maintained ironclad order. The soldiers both revered and feared him. Normally, there were very few chances for them to drink and feast freely, so tonight their joy was doubled. Both inside and outside the campfires blazed high, and songs rang out across the air. Halfway through the night's drinking, loud cheers suddenly erupted ahead. Soldiers rushed over to see, only to discover that Wei Jiao himself had left the city to visit the military camp, personally offering wine in gratitude to the brave men who had fought to reclaim Bo Lang. That their lord would leave the city on his wedding night to visit the troops left the entire camp in raucous excitement. The soldiers swarmed around him, vying to offer toasts and congratulate him on his marriage. Wei Jiao smiled broadly and radiated charisma. He accepted every toast without refusal. Wei Ling, accompanying him, grew worried that Wei Zhao would drink too much and forget to return for the wedding chamber, so he kept trying to shield him and quietly urged him away. Only after much effort did they finally escort Wei Zhao back to the city. By then, it was already late into the night. Once the ceremonies were complete, the bride was led to the wedding chamber in the Xiaoyang residence, where Wei Zhao typically slept. Xiaohe removed her ceremonial robes and then instructed Xuan, Nuan and the other maids to retire for the night. The maids quietly filed out, one after another. In the end, only Xuan Nuan remained behind, hesitating and unwilling to leave. Xuan Nuan's late husband had once been a household soldier of the Qiao family. When she was 20, she bore a daughter, but less than a month after the birth, her husband died in battle. Afterwards, her in-laws no longer wished to keep her and planned to marry her off for money. Later, they heard that the commandant's residence was seeking a suitable wet nurse for the newly born young lady of the Qiao family. They thought that if she were chosen, the reward would surely be greater than selling her off as someone's second wife. So they schemed to have her sent there. Xuan Nuan had a dignified appearance and a strong, healthy body. Upon inquiry, Lady Chao's mother learned that Xuan Nuan was well-behaved and gentle by nature, and that her in-laws merely wished to sell her, which stirred her sympathy. Moreover, Xuan Nuan's husband had died fighting for the Qiao family, which further earned her respect. Thus, Lady Qiao had her perform the necessary rites and appointed her as Xiaoqiao's wet nurse. In gratitude, Xuannan devoted herself wholeheartedly to raising Xiaoqiao from then on. Now that Xiaoqiao was to marry far away, Xuan Nuan naturally refused to be parted from her and had followed her here. The night of the bridal chamber, which ought to have been a perfect and joyful occasion, now seemed to lack a certain sense of fulfillment. Xuan Nuan thought back to Wei Chao's appearance, tall and powerfully built, brimming with strength. One look was enough to tell. He was the kind of man accustomed to licking blood from the edge of a blade. The young lady of the commandant's household, by contrast, was delicate and fragile. Her thigh wasn't even as thick as his arm, and she had only just reached marriageable age. If Wei Zhao had a violent temperament and acted roughly, she feared her young mistress would suffer greatly. The thought left her anxious and uneasy. Though Xuan Nuan was technically a servant, she had served, almost like a second mother to Xiao. Seeing the worried look on her face, Xiaoqiao could tell that Xuan Nuan wished to speak, but held back. She could only try to comfort her. Xuan Nuan forced a smile, then leaned close to Xiaoqiao's ear, repeatedly reminding her, when the marquis entered the room for the Zhou, gong right, the consummation of marriage, she must act frail and gentle to stir his affection. Once a man's heart was softened, he would naturally treat her more tenderly. Whatever you do, don't try to act strong. You must remember this. Remember it well. Hearing her persistent warnings, Xiaoqiao finally understood why the woman had been so reluctant to leave just moments ago. Though she had already lived 2 lifetimes, she lacked experience in this particular matter. Listening to Xuan Nuan's words, she couldn't help blushing slightly, nodding awkwardly in agreement. Only then did Xuan Nuan release her hand and quietly withdraw from the bridal chamber. Now only Xiaoqiao remained, alone in the room, waiting for her groom, Wei Zhao. The bridal chamber was a spacious, orderly bedroom. Just inside the door stood a tall black screen, painted with 6 dragons riding clouds. It divided the room into an outer and inner section. On the large bed beside the screen lay a brand new red quilt. The bedding was perfectly arranged, and jade inlaid red curtains hung gracefully on either side of the bed, serving both as decoration and as a charm to ward off evil for the wedding night. Across from the bed was a low rectangular couch with cushions, a small table at the center of the room, a low cabinet, and a square chest against the wall. On the lampstand, a pair of thick red candles, each no bigger than a child's arm, burned steadily. Aside from these furnishings, the room contained no other decorations. After surveying the room, Xiao Qiao stood alone in the middle, staring blankly at the red candles. Perhaps because Nuan's words about the wedding night had gotten into her head, she now found herself dwelling on them. At first, she had thought little of it, but now an unfamiliar nervousness gradually crept in. In her previous life, many years later, Xiaoko had once secretly met her elder cousin, Da Xiao, one last time. By then, Weizhou had already proclaimed himself emperor, and there was a woman by his side, said to be highly favored. Yet Da Xiao, though his wife in name, was entirely neglected, left to fend for herself. It was from that meeting that Xiao first learned that ever since the day Da Xiao had married him, Weizhou had never touched her, not even with a single fingertip. Although Da Xiao was not as stunningly beautiful as Xiao Qiao, she was still a woman of considerable beauty. Yet he had never touched her, not even once. This showed just how deeply he hated the Qiao family. For him to loathe them to such an extent, and still agree to marry a Qiao daughter, clearly, he was a man of great calculation and patience. Ordinary men could never manage such restraint. This had been Xiao Qiao's impression of him in her previous life. Thus, tonight she assumed Weizhou would likely not touch her either, and if there was no intimacy between them, things would be much easier in the future. But what if he did? If he consummated the marriage, with his size and strength, even if he simply pressed down a little too hard, he could very well cause her to cough up blood. If his mood was sour, quite likely, and he lost control of his animal instincts, given that her body, though technically a married woman now, still had 2 days left before reaching her 15th birthday, she might not survive the night. She truly couldn't imagine herself behaving as Nuan had suggested, using softness to overcome strength beneath him. Though Xiao Qiao had been married to Liu Yan in her previous life, and was no naive girl, she hadn't had the chance to accumulate much actual experience in this matter before fate had transformed her into her current self. The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. At last, she forced herself to regain some calm, sitting back down on the large bed and staring blankly at the canopy in front of her. When she had first arrived here, she had struggled with the local customs of sitting. Currently, high-legged chairs only existed among the northern Hu tribes, while here, sitting on a high chair was considered crude. In public, when seated, one had to choose between 2 postures. Either squat with the buttocks resting on the heels, a fairly comfortable daily sitting style, or kneel with the body upright, known as kneeling straight, the posture used when preparing to rise, or when receiving guests, as a sign of respect. No matter which posture, Xiao Qiao couldn't maintain it for long, certainly not for an entire hour like Nuan, who could sit perfectly still while sewing or embroidering. At home, whenever no guests were present, Xiaoko would stretch her legs straight out to relax, even though Nuan often scolded her for lacking decorum. As a result, she had never truly mastered the art of kneeling for extended periods. She sat properly on the couch for a long time, without seeing Wei Jiao return. The room remained utterly silent. No sounds came from outside. Seeing this, she finally stretched out her legs, pulled a nearby chest over for support, and relaxed her limbs, half reclining on the bed. Outside, the winter chill bit the air, but the room was warmed by a brazier, filled with glowing coals. A faint scent of incense drifted through the air. After a restless night and a day of exhausting ceremonies, Xiao Qiao was growing weary. Gradually, fatigue overtook her. Just as she was about to drift off, she suddenly heard a sound. Someone was coming. Moments later, she heard the voice of a maid outside. "The Lord has returned." "Les Namjun" was the term used by servants and concubines to address the male master of the household. The corresponding title for women was Nujun. Xiao Qiao's drowsiness vanished at once. Rubbing her eyes, she quickly turned over and climbed back onto the couch. Resuming the kneeling position, Moments later, she heard the sound of the door being pushed open. Lifting her gaze, she saw a tall figure behind the screen, seemingly unsteady, swaying as if about to fall. Startled, Xiao Qiao hurriedly straightened up, preparing to step down from the bed. But at that moment, the figure steadied itself and walked past the screen, appearing directly before her. Was it Wei Zhao? It seemed he had drunk quite a bit. His usually sharp, cold face was now tinged with red. Upon entering, he strode straight into the room and began removing his ceremonial attire. With a swish, thud, he tossed the hat and outer robe onto the vanity table without sparing a glance at Xiao Qiao, who was still kneeling half upright on the opposite couch. He then turned toward the large bed, lifted the canopy with one hand, causing the jade beads to chime softly against each other, and proceeded inside. Next came the sound of shoes thudding onto the floor. Thump, thump. Then the room fell silent. Watching him climb directly into bed and seeming to fall asleep in the blink of an eye, Xiao Qiao's tense back finally relaxed. She exhaled quietly, eyes fixed on Wei Zhao lying on the bed, gradually returning to her kneeling posture. Perhaps he truly had fallen asleep, or perhaps he was completely drunk. After a long while, Xiao Qiao carefully stretched out her legs, clenched her fists, and gently massaged her aching calves before settling back into her previous half-reclining posture. And so it was. One person lying on the bed, one person sitting on the couch, both unscathed, aside from the faint incense burned earlier. The air in the room now carried the subtle scent of alcohol from Wei Zhao's body. After a while, the smell was no longer unpleasant, though it made her mind slightly hazy. The night wore on. Xiao Qiao continued leaning against the couch, occasionally dozing off, sometimes jerking awake. Each time she opened her eyes, she would glance at Wei Zhao on the high bed. Seeing him still unmoving, she would relax again and drift off once more. This cycle repeated several times until finally she was awakened by the cold. It was still pitch dark outside the window. Judging by the length of the remaining wedding candles, it was likely the fourth watch of the night. The brazier had nearly burned out, leaving only a faint warmth. The room was now cold, and the chill from outside was creeping in. Shivering, Xiao Qiao hugged herself tightly, rubbing her arms, which were now covered in goosebumps. She figured it wouldn't be long before dawn. Glancing once more at Wei Zhao on the bed, and seeing no movement, she hesitated, then finally stepped down from the couch and tiptoed toward the bed. In the bedchamber, following the customs of the noble class of this era, whether the husband and wife actually shared the bed or not, 2 quilts were always required to be placed on the bed. At this moment, Wei Zhao was lying near the edge of the bed, tilted slightly outward, not even bothering to cover himself with a quilt. Both quilts were still neatly folded and stacked toward the inner side of the bed. Xiao Qiao moved silently toward the foot of the bed, standing next to Wei Zhao's feet. She quietly looked at him. He was lying on his back. Because of his tall stature and long legs, his body occupied more than half of the bed. The flush on his face from the alcohol had now faded somewhat, perhaps because the dim light didn't quite reach this corner of the bed. His face appeared strangely peaceful. The pair of thick black brows looked even more pleasing to the eye. His eyes were closed in deep sleep. Xiao Qiao held her breath, carefully leaning forward. Her body brushed lightly against his feet as she reached out, trying to pull the quilt closest to her from the bed. But suddenly, Wei Zhao woke up. His eyes snapped open. The sharp sound of a sword being drawn rang out beside her ear. Before she could even see what was happening, Wei Zhao had already pulled a longsword from beneath his pillow, leapt down from the bed, and in an instant, the cold blade was pressed against her neck. The entire action took place in the blink of an eye. Xiao Qiao froze. She could clearly feel the icy tip of the blade pressed against her skin, the fine hairs on her body standing on end. This cold was entirely different from the chill in the room. She could even smell the faint scent of rust from the blade. She knew it was the scent of blood. Slowly, Xiao turned her head and met his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, a faint killing intent gleaming within them. I was feeling cold. I only wanted to pull a quilt over me. I didn't mean to disturb you. She tried her best to speak in a calm voice, but in her heart, she was certain. She truly hadn't touched him at all. Wei just stared at her for a few seconds, then looked around the room, decorated in bright red. It was as if something dawned on him. He closed his eyes, raised a hand to pinch his brow, and the murderous aura surrounding him finally dissipated. Slowly, he lowered the sword.